Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
In 2016, Reliance Jio completely revolutionized India's relationship with data by drastically dropping the costs of 4G data to rock bottom levels. And with that, we saw the internet boom as tech giants like Meta, Google, and even other internet companies jumped into these data highways to provide over-the-top internet services for Indians on really cheap data. From digital transactions to calls to food delivery to edtech, India has made multiple unicorns on the back of access to cheap and easily accessible internet. And now telecom operators want their cut, and government also wants to bring these OTT applications under the fold of the Communications Ministry. Hello and welcome to another episode of Business Line State of the Economy podcast. I'm your host, Ayushi Kar. I'm a tech journalist with the publication, and today we will be discussing the many facets of the debate for the new regulatory mechanism for OTT apps that is now in consideration. I have with me two esteemed guests, Dr. Mansi Kedia. She's a senior fellow at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. And Mr. Bharath Reddy is a program manager of graduate certificate in public policy for technology and policy at the program in Takshashila. Both of these individuals have had extensive research experience in the field of tech policy, and we will be talking to them about the new regulations that are being considered for OTT applications on top of internet services that could likely come into the fray with the new telecom bill that is under discussion. Welcome, Mansi and Bharat. Let's jump right into the argument of telecom operators. And these are not necessarily new arguments. We have debates around this that have been in the fray in EU as well, where telcos and EU sort of want to levy fees against big tech because they think that they're not contributing adequately as far as revenues are concerned to the kind of capital investments that telecom operators are making on the network side. And there was quite a nifty analysis done by TRAI of like how operators' revenues have evolved since 2013, since data has become more ubiquitous and cheap in India. And the revenue stream that was coming from calls and SMSs has significantly reduced to what it was at 58% in 2013 to now it is much less. It's below 10% as per the recent numbers. So do you think in this kind of environment where telcos are increasingly having to rely on data for their revenues, which is inherently populated by all these internet companies, is there some sincerity in the argument when they want some kind of level playing field from the ministry or some sort of cut from these OTT players when it comes to sort of investing into their network at the moment? Bharat.
Thanks, Ayushi. It's great to be here. So the telcos claim that they are highly taxed and they're highly regulated. So there's a license fee that they have to bear, there's spectrum costs, there's telecom equipment costs, and security infrastructure, all of these things. And there's even a universal service obligation fund they need to contribute to. So all of these are an additional burden on the telecom service providers. And OTT platforms, or communication platforms, they're offering similar, maybe, substitute products, which without having to comply with any of these, either regulatory costs or the monetary costs involved. So there's an unequal footing, and it's not a really level playing field. And they say that they're losing market share in the messaging or the calling revenue that they used to get, and that's going to these communication services. So they say that they have high capital investments because of the transition to 5G and later to 6G, and to keep a pace with the growing needs of the data, which is increasing exponentially, they need to upgrade their infrastructure. Revenue generated is not enough to meet these needs, and that the communication service providers need to pitch in and have to compensate for some of these the cost that they benefit from the infrastructure that they're benefiting from. So this is, I think, in a nutshell, what the argument of the telecom service providers is. Maybe we can see what we think about it as we go along.
So Mansi, in this paradigm, like this is what they are. This is obviously what telecom operators are stating, that this is the kind of premise that they are operating in. But given the kind of slowish investments that they are sort of making in 5G, when even as, let's say, a journalist, I'm not able to really understand where monetization for telcos really lies in the kind of new areas of network that they are entering into. Do you think that there is an element of sincerity to these arguments, that there is a need for the government to potentially consider how we can bolster telcos revenues, and in doing so, we need to sort of get OTT players to kind of participate in the play? I mean, obviously, governments globally have shut this idea down. When EU was discussing this, I think 18 countries shut the potential idea down of big tech sharing some costs in networks. You're paying some amount of fee to telecom operators so that they are better compensated for how the networks are opening and more players can sort of enter into an area that was normally populated purely by telcos. So do you think that there is a need, and the government has identified a key vein of concern for these telcos, and this needs to be addressed in some way?
Ayushi, and thank you for inviting me. Let me sort of break this question into two parts. I think there is sincerity in part where the telcos are arguing that their business models have been deeply affected by substitutable services, even if they are not even though they are functionally similar, they are completely different entities. So there is obviously a disruption when it comes to the existing business models and the revenue sources for the telcos, which means that they have lesser at hand to do multiple activities, including investment in infrastructure. And there is also sincerity in the argument that there is only so much that they can put into investment given the current financial health. And here I'm excluding, let's say, Reliance Jio and to some extent Airtel, which are Reliance Jio has been running profits for a few years. Airtel recently turned around, but we have only two, like well-running, well-established operators. Vodafone Idea is still running a loss, and we don't know, slightly uncertain about what the future would look like. So in this scenario, it is true that there may not be enough money flowing in as investments as is requisite for the growth of India's infrastructure segment. So these two arguments are true and sincere, in my opinion. Whether the telcos say that OTT should be paying them, I sort of disagree with that part of the argument. I mean, why should OTTs pay them? OTTs may want to contribute to, may be required to contribute to the overall investments in infrastructure. Is a separate question from OTTs wanting to, the OTTs having to pay to telcos. In fact, I would think that any such arrangement would actually risk too much concentration and centralization of digital infrastructure and content in the economy. So I'd be very worried if that were to happen. I would rather, and because of concerns of where the money would come from and we require these investments, it is true that at this point, OTT seems to be the big OTTs, or let's say the large traffic generating OTTs seem to be the entities who can help contribute to the infrastructure investment, but not in a way where they're liable to pay to the telcos. We've made some proposals in our report, and they're obviously subject to modification, but I think there is merit in considering that OTTs, given that they benefit and given that their survival depends on the existence of infrastructure, if we look at it in a very dynamic and in a long-term sense, if quality of infrastructure investment improves, then everyone stands to gain from it. So let me stop here. In fact, I think you also made an important point, which I wanted to go back to, which is investments in 5G, and that is also because there's no clear market for 5G at the moment. If you really ask a lot of individuals, including me, that what is the difference between a 5G and 4G, it's not discernible, and therefore I have very little incentive to upgrade to 5G and pay 100 rupees more, 200 rupees
Correct.
more. So yeah, so it is true that telcos don't know where the money will really come from for them to pump more and more into it in investment. So there's an investment gap that needs to be filled up. And the key question in my mind is that, and not whether OTTs should pay to telcos because there is a lack of a level playing field. So that part of the argument I disagree with.
So two questions here. Like, I mean, this whole idea of OTTs somehow paying some kind of levy to the government. I mean, when the telecom bill was in discussion and I started covering this, there was a whole vein in which the government wanted OTT players to pay some form of license fee to kind of make it a similar kind of service as is the case with your telecom operators. And also they also introduced like a slew of other requirements that they could potentially want in the draft telecom space, which is from eKYC to security concerns to sort of make it more and more under the fold of Ministry of Communications, get these companies also registered in India, potentially also regulate apps like Signal, etc., which kind of fly under the radar in this space. And that sort of opens another kind of myriad of debate around should you want something like a KYC if you're operating on a messenger or on a Signal or on a Twitter for that matter. The way the kind of this debate is opening up now, OTT players are also asking that instead of like, if you want to introduce some sort of regulation, it is much better to be done under Ministry of IT instead of Ministry of Communications or the DOT. And then there is this eternal battle happening between the ministries on the other side as well. What I'm trying to get here is where does that ideal regulation lie? Is there any kind of model internationally that we can potentially take note of? Or is this a completely new field entirely across the globe? And what is that sort of middle ground that allows for the key problems that we have identified with telecom operators around level playing field, all of those other things to be addressed, as well as the government's concerns around security and just generally like knowing where things are? If that's something that you or Bharath could comment on.
So I don't know if there's any kind of a precedence, but the problem I see with requiring KYC or something like that is that these communication services operate across geographies, right? They're usually global in nature, and it gets really complex for them to comply with regional kind of regulations like this. So if India has a different kind of regulation, in Europe they have a different thing. So, and they're not able to comply effectively with all of them. You might have a kind of a splinter net where each region has their own communication platform. They might not be able to effectively talk to each other. So the value of WhatsApp, for example, is that I can call anybody irrespective of where they are, and it's not just one specific purpose, right? So you can text someone, you can call someone. It serves as a community building tool of late. It also allows you to maybe transfer money to somebody. So all of these different use cases in one single application. So it's not directly substitutable with what the telecom service providers offer, and so it's a different. It's not the same way you would regulate a telecom service provider. And another thing I want to add about the regulation, I mean the having the big tech firms or the communication platforms pay for the infrastructure is that the customers who are using this infrastructure are already paying for it. So everyone who subscribes to content from, say, OTT entertainment platforms, or through you're downloading a message, or you're sharing something on WhatsApp, you're already paying for the data that you use as a customer, right? So why do you need to charge? Why does the same thing have to be charged twice, once from the customers and once from the OTT platform. So it does not, that just doesn't add up for me.
Right. Mansi, do you think that there is, firstly, like I'm very curious to know what are the alternatives to these tech companies potentially paying to telcos? Like, how do you address that investment gap? But do you also think that the Ministry of Communications is kind of overstepping in this area to try to get into the fray of trying to regulate communication OTTs in particular? Or do you think that that is something that they have kind of rightly identified at this point, especially with like how they also like beyond just investment, they also are like payment for networks. They clearly want kind of a similar awareness of where the user is on the network as they potentially have in the telecommunication side to sort of emerge for a WhatsApp or a Signal, something like that.
So, I think it's true that, that WhatsApp and all such OTT communication apps have obviously become of scale to the extent that, these questions have arisen. I don't think like 5 years ago, people were worrying so much about it. And it was not only in terms of the revenues of telcos. So, I think that it's important that we move out of this us versus them that keeps happening in the sector, because at least as far as we are concerned, we should be concerned as public policy professionals. To us, both are equally important, but very often OTTs and telcos get pitted against each other, where I think in practice there's a lot more cooperation and collaboration. But when it comes to these policies and licenses, it becomes very combative. However, having said that, WhatsApp has, and not so much the other communication apps, but they have, and there is a graying of zones, right? You have now Zoom and WebEx also having some sort of licenses. Some have a numbering scheme, some don't have a numbering scheme. We always had the VoIP. So regulations around these are evolving because technology is moving way too fast. But if, like, I agree with Bharath that while WhatsApp is not similar to Airtel, functionally, I can make a call from WhatsApp and I can message and I can do other things that Airtel allows me to do, except that Airtel does not have WhatsApp doesn't have a network of its own. So without Airtel, WhatsApp is meaningless. So if that is the case, then I liken WhatsApp to what we call the virtual network operators, where you are basically leasing in the infrastructure or borrowing or whatever you may want to call it, riding upon the infrastructure to deliver your service. So obviously, then that would mean that even if for security reasons or to contain or any sort of mishap or misuse that may happen on WhatsApp, given that it's become such a huge communication medium, it cannot be exactly how Airtel is being regulated, because it controls a huge amount of critical infrastructure, and the structuring of the business and the types of services it offers is very different from that of WhatsApp and Airtel today. But to some extent, WhatsApp can be likened to what you call a virtual network operator, which is basically providing services, communication services riding on somebody else's network. So it's not completely, to answer your first question, it's not completely outside the domain of DOT. I feel like it is, because it is used as a communication platform, and you cannot think of it purely as a content platform. Like, should Netflix be managed, regulated, licensed by DOT? No. Should WhatsApp be? Perhaps yes. That's where I would stand in terms of, so the types of OTTs are different. We're only talking about communications OTT because they do play a huge role in communications, and there is no, which does not mean that they become equivalent to today's Airtel or Jio, but they do become equivalent to some of the VoIP services and some of the VNO services that see some sort of minimalistic licensing.
Yeah. This is my last question, and I'll let you guys go. Net neutrality is the term that was being thrown around. I think it was more to do with when these telcos started to say that we want to charge a Facebook to use our network to potentially access consumers and stuff. So obviously, it creates for an area where a free free internet is not something that can be kind of proliferated. So obviously you have a bunch of civil liberty organizations, etc., start talking about net neutrality. Is that something that the government needs to be sort of, like how do you best protect net neutrality? Is it purely through license fees and through direct regulation from the government, or can the government potentially explore some other partnership with telcos and OTTs and some kind of collaboration that they were also alluding to and that model still allow for net neutrality in some way? Is that even something, or is it like a slippery slope once you start seeking those kind of interactions between OTT and telcos, then obviously like a free and fair that sort of internet is not going to come about.
So the idea behind net neutrality is that the internet service providers should treat all content equally, irrespective of the origin of that content. So it means that these companies should treat all data equally. That's one thing, and also the platforms from where this content is originating, they should not be paying the operators to deliver their content over a faster lane, or that the end users end up paying lesser because a part of that cost is being subsidized by these companies, right? So all data is equal, all end users access it all the same. So it has a lot of benefits. It is good for a startup to be able to compete with a big tech firm because their data is going to be treated on par. It's good for it helps prevent consolidation of market power either at the service provider level or at the tech companies that are providing these communication services. The way things are, I think that works better. So you treat the network as a pipe, and everything that flows through it should be treated equally. So you can have different quality of service for different kinds of content. For example, a voice data might be treated very differently compared to if you're watching a movie and the video content is being streamed. Or you're playing a live game and that requires very fast data to be transferred, but even if there is a few losses. So different kind of applications have different requirements. So distinguishing between those kinds of applications is fine, but within one kind of application, there should be no differentiation based on the source of that data or which provider is serving that data. So yeah, I think the way it is it works fine, and I don't think there should be any kind of a levy on the communication platforms or the entertainment platforms.
Right. Just finally, just one more thing about selective banning of apps. It is something the government has been trying to explore. Obviously, there is one side of it where it says that this is not even technically possible, that I can selectively ban a Facebook in this particular area, or like certain apps in this certain kind of geography where you're having a particular unrest, etc., happening. Do you think that is something kind of worth exploring though still, to sort of still allow for access to it? I mean, obviously there is this whole debate about whether or not internet shutdown should be imposed in the first place. Like, government has its arguments, and the society clearly points out like the kind of policies that exist within that. But is selective banning a less aggressive approach to the debate that allows for sort of other parts of internet, of how businesses access internet, or different entities in those, or institutions in those areas access internet, still be kind of allowed for, and specific apps that the government particularly deems to be whatever inflammatory or whatever their reasons are, so that should be banned? Is that something that should likely be explored, and is it even possible on a technical level for implementation of the kind of approach that the government is taking now?
So, I think these selective bans actually could lead to worse outcomes. So, firstly, people might find ways to go around these bans by either using VPNs or proxies or something like that. Other than that, you might also see alternative platforms emerge in these kind of conflict-prone areas, and these platforms might not be the best, which are in terms of content moderation or being accountable for the kind of security they provide to the users or the kind of content that's shared between those users. And the more you try to ban different applications, people will find ways around it. Alternative applications will come up to serve that need. So if there is, so this is I think a very important problem of the age that we're living in. So you have information which travels very fast. You have consequences of the speed at which that information travels, and that's a challenge that has to be addressed. This might not be the best way to approach it. So people will find ways around it. People will find a different platform, and in the long term, you might be worse off than where you are. So you might, where you are now, you can still have these big platforms which are trying to regulate hate speech or disinformation on their platforms, and that's a challenge. But it's trying to. I mean, there are efforts to address them. But when you have silos which are completely out of the and where there are no efforts to regulate the content, so you'll be in a worse off position than where we are right now. So I think banning the internet is not the best approach, and banning selectively some applications is not good either. More efforts should be made at transparency, at maybe and there are good reasons why people use these applications also. When you are in a conflict prone area, you want to maybe let your relatives know that you're safe. You want to all of these are also kind of lost when you selectively ban a certain app or or turn off the internet at all completely, right? So you need to find better ways to maybe deal with the disinformation or the hate speech that goes on. And it is a difficult challenge, but it's something that we need to figure out how to do.
Yeah. Mansi, any concluding thoughts?
No, I completely agree with Bharat. I don't think, that selective banning of apps is a good idea to deal with the problem of misinformation and we've done some field level work on, how different states and different emergency situations are responded to. And, while for some states we found that, it's just pure inaction and a lazy attitude and just thinking that, okay, let's just ban the internet and, things will come under control. But in certain states, and interestingly, when, we were interviewing in Jammu and Kashmir, in Srinagar, those officials had really spent a lot of time to see how they could minimize the impacts, to the extent, like some really interesting things that they had tried to do is that they said, okay, and this was 4-5 years ago, but I think it still holds true. They were saying that most of the misinformation is spreading through, videos or images, where people get enticed by seeing some video or something like that. So they would slow down the speed of the internet instead of shutting it down. So people could, they could still call each other, they could still send WhatsApp messages, but the video uploads and picture uploads wouldn't happen. Then they also did something that, depending on where the terrain was, if it was a hilly terrain, they would just sort of turn off one single tower because they knew that the perpetrators or the movement will not cross over quickly. While when it was happening in plains, then they had to shut off a larger part of the larger parts of the network. But then there were other states who, even if they were practicing it, spent a lot of time doing assessment of whether it worked or whether it didn't work. But the fact that they were trying to justify and explain why and how, in the absence of other mechanisms, they were trying to minimize the impact. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, honestly. But definitely selective banning of a few apps, I completely agree. I don't think it helps. It's just going to, nothing is stopping people from coming up with newer platforms or finding other ways to access these apps. So not in favor of that in terms of, and shutdowns is a bad idea overall, but I just wanted to highlight these one or two interesting things we picked up from the field, where these cybersecurity officers and people who are really managing these conflict situations were thinking on their feet and trying to minimize the impact on civilians.
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. I did not know that there was some like circumspecting in like how they are thinking about internet shutdowns at local level. Yeah, I think that's all I had to ask you guys though. Thank you so much for taking part.
Sure, pleasure to be here. Thanks, Bharath. Thank you, Ayushi.
Thanks, Ayushi. Yeah, thanks, Mansi. Nice having this conversation.